right?
There you
Okay.
go. You can use this or whatever you feel most comfortable with this.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here soon. Okay, welcome this morning to Geriatric's Grand Rounds. Thank you to those who came in person and braved the snow. I'm sure we also have a large Zoom contingency. We have a wonderful speaker today, MT Connolly, who's going to be talking to us about elder justice field and the history. MT is one of my mentors, and so I'm really excited she was able to come out and be with us today. Our next grand rounds will be on the 21st, and Bree Betcher will be talking to us about biomarkers and Alzheimer's disease and other updates. Our next journal club is next week on the 14th over Zoom. Dr. Runkle will be moderating again, filling in for Dr. Walker, who's home with his adorable baby girl. The Geriatrics Division meeting will follow today's presentation. And following today's grand rounds, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint with an online evaluation. So please submit those for Jessica. And please submit questions into the chat or Q&A boxes anytime during this presentation, and we will monitor that. So it's my pleasure to welcome MT. MT Connolly is a writer, lawyer, researcher, policy expert, and MacArthur Foundation Fellow, so a certified genius, who works to make longevity more joyful, gentle, and just. Her 2023 book, The Measure of Our Age, Navigating Care, Safety, Money, and Meaning in Later Life, chronicles the elder justice field's evolution and the role of caregiving, money, policy, autonomy, and safety balancing in the protective power of connection, purpose, and awe. MT was the founding head of the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative, architect of the Elder Justice Act, which was enacted with the Affordable Care Act, and co-designer of the RISE model, a new conceptually grounded holistic approach to prevent and respond to elder abuse and neglect. Promising pilot data from Maine led HHS to fund the nonprofit RISE Collaborative to replicate and study RISE with APS in 3 new locations. And in 2024, the World Health Organization selected RISE from among 89 interventions to replicate and test internationally. RISE has also been piloted as an alternative to incarceration in criminal elder abuse cases, and is one of our field's first really clearly evidence-based approach. So very excited to have MT, so please welcome her today. Can everyone hear?
I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all. When I was kind of thinking, oh, I think maybe I'm going to change what I'm going to say a little bit, but you know, it's a fool's errand, of course, to be doing that in the middle of the night before Grand Rounds talk. But you know, who am I not to embark on fool's errands? Elizabeth said it's geriatrics, and so thank you for being my people. I think it's worth just taking stock of what happened yesterday. There was an Elder Justice Summit that I know Elizabeth and I have been talking about, and many of you have been talking about for a long time. And initially it was like, oh, 30 people are going to show up. Oh, a few more. There were 150 people yesterday on that day. And I think it bespeaks a real appetite and enthusiasm to start working together across a lot of different silos. And I think it's a great reflection on the work that you all are doing and also on what is possible here in Colorado. And that's going to be one of my themes. So thank you all, especially Elizabeth. And you know, it's a lovely stage in life when your mentees become your mentors. So I'm psyched about that. Slides. Sorry. Oh, okay. And then I can do this. Okay. Okay. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I was still revising it a few minutes ago. Okay. So with apologies to those of you who were there yesterday, early child abuse forensics, I think, are illustrative and help explain where we are in the elder abuse field a little bit, or at least help explain where we're not. So there was a lot of observational research culminating with the battered child syndrome, which was a JAMA article in 1962 by Henry Kemp here. It was a watershed article. JAMA called it one of the most influential of the 20th century. Why? That's what I wanted to figure out. Like, why did that help launch what this woman, Barbara Nelson, who wrote an article called Making an Issue of Child Abuse, called The Rediscovery of Child Abuse. Of course, child abuse has been with us since there have been human beings. But the question is, why did it become an issue, a salient issue in the medical field, in politics, and in policy? So I think the data were just shocking. It's a group of victims that people are accustomed, are not accustomed to thinking of as abused. There was a lot of press attention to Kemp's article. It was the 60s and 70s when we had a different notion, shall we say, of rights and services. He did something really savvy, I think, which is a mixed bag probably in the large picture, but he medicalized a social problem. And just sort of as an asterisk, I think in elder abuse, the primary lane comes out of social services, and violence against women, they really inhabited and embraced the criminal and law enforcement approach. And so it's a really interesting, I'm not going to talk about it too much today, but I think in terms of thinking about what lanes we inhabit and what influence we can have, it's interesting to consider that. Pediatricians were high status, high credibility messengers, and Kemp himself was a really savvy advocate. And as Elizabeth told me, he got Dick Krugman, who had been in Washington, to come and basically help advise him on the political aspects, because this stuff just doesn't happen out of nowhere. There's always a ton of work if you see an issue sort of gain prominence. So turning to elder abuse. It's a huge issue that people basically don't know exists. It's about 1 in 10 people 60 and older are victimized. Rates are higher, much higher actually, for people with dementia and people in institutions. Dementia, there are a bunch of small articles that hover around the 50% mark, and institutions we actually don't really know. Work by Mark Lax and JAMA in 1998 indicated that it hastens mortality by 3 times. The Weill Cornell team did research on what they call concerned persons, basically who's downstream from elder abuse. And if we think about our own lives, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of stuff going on if you have an older relative who is being harmed in a facility or neglected, or where you don't know where those bruises came from, even though you thought that you really loved the caregiver, or they start to give away money, or there's, the basement son, somebody, a family member who has mental health or substance issues, who's living there and not, really providing care, but there's deep entanglement. Okay, so the data are wild. I mean, they're based on extrapolations, but that there are more than 30 million concerned persons who are extremely stressed in trying to help an older person who is subjected to elder abuse. And then there's the cost, which we don't talk about, and we don't really have measures. You guys, not you guys, but in child abuse, there are some, they've at least tried to calculate it, and it's it's hundreds of billions of dollars. But I think there's every reason to believe that elder abuse is super expensive. It quadruples rates of nursing home admission and triples rates of hospital admission. And, you can do the math. I think it's worth just landing briefly on the longevity paradox. In 1900, we lived an average of 48 years. Now we live an average of 78 years. That's not equitably distributed, but that's the average. But healthy life expectancy is only 66. That's a big delta in terms of the amount of additional care that older people are going to need. And we have not done very much to meet that need. In 2034, the number of older people is going to outnumber the number of younger people. But we want to get old. We don't want to be old. And so that really skews our systems because we've put so much more into extending longevity than into assuring well-being as we age. Okay, so if we look at changes in policy and practice, this is just super shorthand. So the heyday of mandatory reporting laws, and it actually persists, were 63 to 67 in terms of child abuse. Elder abuse often stood on the shoulders of, if that's the right term, of the child abuse field and emulated a bunch of stuff, unproven though it may have been, and not ever really asking, does this really fit an older population? And one of my pet peeves is we say, oh, there's been so much legislation in elder abuse. And what it is generally at the state level, what it is generally is enacting mandatory reporting laws or criminalizing additional conduct. And we have no clue what the impact of any of that is in terms of the well-being of the people we're trying to serve. You guys launched the Kemp Center here at the University of Colorado in 1972, which I think is a really interesting model and helped inform the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which was eventually enacted in 1974. But CAPTA is a reactive law. There was a law in 1971 that would have been proactive, a child welfare law to try and prevent child abuse, but Nixon vetoed it. And so then Walter Mondale, who is the primary sponsor, came back and thought, okay, we're just going to have to basically put a bunch of people testifying and not looking at the poverty issues because poverty, mental health, all that is not so salient, but look at upper middle class people who have child abuse in their families. And so then they got CAPTA through. In terms of the elder abuse field, there's some teams, but they're basically teams of people who analyze cases together. It's not the kind of service, research, learning teams that the Kemp Center is. The Elder Justice Act was enacted in 2010, and for me, the results were really disappointing, actually, because here, let's see. This kind of shows the by their budgets, you shall know them. So CAPTA and related child welfare laws get a lot of money a year on the order, over $1 billion a year. VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, gets about 500 million. The Elder Justice Act was enacted in 2010, zero funds until 2015, then a few trifling amounts, a little bolus of money with COVID relief funds, and now it's back down to basically trifling funds. The disparities are evident in other areas as well. Child abuse pediatrics is a thing because there's a scientific basis for it. Forensic geriatrics is not a thing. There is, and I think actually, one of the things that is important to note here is that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force did not recommend and does not recommend screening for elder abuse in EDs or in hospital settings because of the lack of the scientific basis. And I think that is something that continues to haunt us, both in terms of screening, but also as Richard Gellis, who was a family violence researcher, said, we're marching people off into an abyss. We don't know what we're screening them into. And unless we know that what we're screening them into is better than what we're screening them out of, then what are the ethical implications of screening? I was sort of struck by what Dick Krogman had to say yesterday, which is basically there's been no progress in the child abuse field for 30 years and that there's no outcome data in terms of the impact or, and so, I had sort of thought, oh, you guys are, or not you guys meaning, but thinking that child abuse is so far ahead of elder abuse. But I think this is a huge malady in our, in the way we think about things. And it's gotten sort of invisible. I mean, if we don't know what works. We have all these interventions. We put all this money into it. We have no clue which one of them work in the elder abuse field. And I think the most egregious absence of all is that we don't know how to prevent elder abuse. Like really all we have is to say, don't get isolated, don't get lonely. And that's really just not that impressive. And why do we need it? We need intervention data for citizens, for individuals, for families, in terms of like to plan. We need it for you all, for professionals, but also for lawyers and guardians and adult protective services workers. We want to know whether what we're doing is effective and how we're treating patients. And we want it for societal reasons. We want to know broadly what's the impact of the interventions, and are we allocating scarce resources where they're most effective? And we don't know the answers to that. The ethical conundrums of elder abuse. So I think this was partially what we talked about. We've talked about that a little bit in the last few days, and I've been increasingly getting on a soapbox about this. I think they're pervasive, they're poorly understood, they're understudied. There's no guidance, and there's not even a framework for navigating them, even though they're massive, right? Every family is struggling with whether to take away the car keys. It's the conversation we had this year about our politicians. What is too old? And really, that is part of this kind of conversation. And yet we don't translate it as an aging field into conversations about how should we be balancing autonomy and safety? What are the implications for individuals, for families, for professionals, and for society? These issues have everything to do with elder justice. Decisions about whether somebody who says they want to live with a harmer and who might also be a caregiver, should they be entitled to? Living in squalor, spending or giving away money, refusing care, living alone at risk, having sex without discernible consent if you have dementia, for example. And caregiver promises. I was really struck by the family member who spoke at the summit yesterday, Leanne, because she had promised her mother, we're never going to put you in a home. And the amount of suffering that that promise leads to, given the fact that we really don't have an intact long-term care system, is massive and also unmeasured, and creates a kind of moral burden for families. And I think also for professionals and providers, because we don't know what to do. Like the person was promised. And one reason for it is that we don't have a long-term care system people trust, right? We're scared of it, but also people want to stay at home. We have the great American, like, we're going to stay independent, and we equate success with staying alone, bunkered in our homes, notwithstanding the consequences of that. So I think there are huge numbers of ethical issues that have really significant impact on our work and on how we work with older people. The tools we have to address autonomy safety are really very limited. They're blunt, they're usually unmonitored, and almost entirely unstudied. We don't know how many guardianships there are, how many powers of attorneys there are. Power of attorney is both advertised as a great way to protect yourself and a license to steal. And it's both, right? Depending on the situation and the family, and it can evolve from one to the other over time. We have some tools like supported decision-making or interdependent decision-making that are evolving. They've been largely untested with older people. Actually, they've been largely untested with anybody. But dementia is different than a developmental disability, which is where supported decision-making evolved. And so I think there's promise, but these things are really like in the eye of the beholder. People have very different impressions of what it means to do, to be person-centered, to support someone's decision-making, et cetera. Okay, a couple things I think in terms of assessing risk, excuse me, is that we need to separate out risk to the self and risk to others. And so that the bar in terms of like the ability to make a decision and whether we're going to respect that decision, whether we honor somebody's decision to make risky decisions, is different if they're taking the risk on themselves than if they're taking the risk on behalf of somebody else. If you're driving, if you're a surgeon, if you're flying planes, if you're governing, there are environmental hazards. Think about hoarding cases. I think financial loss raises a really interesting question, particularly in light of sort of issues of generational wealth that we see both. And so families that have lived in poverty, that have finally accumulated a nest egg, are in a different kind of precarious situation. And so should we be thinking about the interest of family members if mom is suddenly spending everything, or, either because she's being scammed or, so in it, or in terms of making care choices. So these are super complicated decisions. What am I trying to say? Super complicated issues to puzzle through. And I'm not telling you all anything, but lawyers on medical stuff here. But there are different factors that influence the decision making, and then different sorts of decisions. And I think we sort of almost need two axes to say, okay, with delirium, you're trying to make a decision about, blank. How do you measure what the incapacity, how the decision-making is compromised, and line that up with the type of decision that is at play, in terms of respecting decisions or not, overriding them. Okay, so just to close that, it's a vital area in need of study. And I think you guys are actually extremely well poised because you're facing these questions every day with VESPA, I assume, and in geriatric practices in general. Okay, now I'm going to move on to RISE, because those ethical decisions really helped us, help to inform RISE. So let's just talk about the evolution of adult protective services quickly. As I was doing research in this, and this was really striking to me. Okay, so in the 50s, there's a lot of concern about older people who can't manage, right? What we now call by that horrifying term self-neglect. But and there were bankers and insurance agents and employers and everybody going to aging experts saying, what are we going to do? They can't make decisions anymore, or they're living in squalor, or whatever the thing is. Congress funded 7 studies of protective service models, and some of them were elder protective, et cetera. And the results of those RCTs, they were all RCTs, were really poor. In Cleveland, the Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging did a randomized control study of what was then sort of gold-plated protective services. Like the list of services that they had was just amazing. And over the decade where they followed the intervention, the people who were in the treatment group died sooner and were institutionalized more often. And still, Congress and advocates pushed, and APS indeed landed in every state, and the efficacy has not been tested since. So as I thought more about it, there are really 3 mysteries here. The first one is, why were the outcomes poor? Nobody ever really asked or studied this. And I think it probably is, and what sort of the general article of faith in the field is that when you erode people's rights or override people's rights, the outcomes are not better, right? People feel violated. And so that is not, and there's probably an element also of institutionalization, that if the answer or the treatment or solution was sticking people in a nursing home, that might have compounded problems too. The second 2 are more complicated for me. Why did we still push for APS? These are well-meaning people trying to do the right thing. And that I think I've put in a few buckets. Margaret Blenkner, who was the woman who did the research in Cleveland at the Benjamin Rose Institute, found that although the clients were worse off, collaterals, meaning family, friends, professionals, city agency workers, they were better off. They thought, oh, this is great. Their stress was relieved. So the collaterals are better off. Who makes the laws? It's not the clients, right? Who does the advocacy? It's the collaterals. And there's that wonderful saying, we want safety for the people we love, but autonomy for ourselves, right? And we know that through life, and anybody who's been a teenager or had one certainly knows it. So I think that's one reason. I think a second reason is paternalism, and it was a different era. I mean, we maybe haven't changed as much as we should, but we certainly have changed in terms of sort of the hierarchies and paternalistic responses. And so it was an era where we know best, we're just going to enact this law. And then there's elements of political expedience. I mean, Congress was there, they wanted a program, they wanted to fund it. And I had this when I was working on the Elder Justice Act. where I was, at some point I was freaking out. I'm like, this is such a huge responsibility. What do I know? How can I actually do this? And so I called one of the lead drafters of the Violence Against Women Act, and she said, you just have to do it. You have to do your very best, and then you can change it later. Well, the problem with that, with laws, is that they're very hard to change later. And so, yeah, for me, one really painful thing is many of my mistakes. It's like literally my ideas in 2002 are codified, and there for the whole world to see. But in any event, that's just what happens if you do stuff. But and it's true of VAWA, right? Like it was part of the crime bill. It was a very, very, mandatory arrest, mandatory prosecution, no drop laws. It was a heavy criminal approach that has come into significant come in for significant criticism. And we see the medicalizing also encased in the law in the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act. Okay, so that takes us to the third mystery. Why has APS not been studied since? And here I think that we want a place to call. Like we have these really complicated problems. We just need a place to send those cases because we don't know what the hell else to do with them really. And so and it's a different kind of, it's a social expedience combined with a low status of an inability to advocate of the people involved, right? Like the people who are the clients are among the least powerful and most vulnerable citizens we have. And they are not, they're not out there advocating for themselves. And so, that means that it's us, the collaterals, who are doing that part. And so, like it's sort of an any port in a storm thing. And then over time, it gets invisible. There's a philosopher's joke about these two young fish who swim along and they pass an older fish. And he says, hey, boys, how's the water? And they look at one another and say, what's the water? What's water? Because the things that are most pervasive that surround us become the hardest to see. And so although there was a good amount of criticism early on, over time, that just became the way we did things, right? And those are the structures and those are the silos we lived in. And we didn't study it. So, we're sort of in this data-free zone, so we don't really have to face what the impact is because we don't ask in any sort of methodologically sound way. And so we are basically stuck with the good intentions and the fervent beliefs of people in the 70s. And there we are. Okay. So in creating new programs and paradigms, it's super important, I think, to ask clients individually, but also writ large, what do you want? Also to ask providers, what tools do you need? And in the conversations we had at our tables, like Carrie, the one we had at our table yesterday, I think it was really striking that we have these silos, right? Well, APS can do this, and the cops can do this, and the prosecutors can do this. And the interstitial spaces, there's nothing, right? There's like, how do we fill the interstitial spaces in a way that works? And then how do we collect data? And so I think one really important tenet here is in building new interventions to think strategically, to think about the communications aspects, because this is a really complex field. We need to communicate well with our partners, and we need to have basic respect. Everyone's trying to do their best in totally unprepared and sort of ass-backward systems. So so it's easy to cast blame, but that isn't really what we're about. And in this, the DARE parable really helped me. So DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, which some of you might remember from the 80s, it was in 75% of schools. The data showed that it didn't do anything. It was totally ineffective. And there were like study after study, I can't remember, like 36 studies or something. So why did it persist in 75% of schools? Because it served other purposes, right? Teachers got a period off. got a free period, schools got free security, cops got to take a look at what the kids were doing. So it was serving different needs. No one actually really cared that much whether the intervention itself worked. And so then there was a policy debate. Should we kill DARE because it's not working, or should we use DARE? And this is, and I was really struck by this because I was trying to figure out how do we affect change? And DARE, you know, it basically created infrastructure and funding, right? Infrastructure in every school and funding. That's really, for me, what we have in APS. We have infrastructure and we have funding, and we have people of goodwill who want to do better. So how do we figure out how to do better? And so that's why I think it's so important to both study APS, but also what we did, because studying APS is complicated for reasons I don't need to explain to you. But also, I think one end run around that is to say, okay, we're going to augment APS and see if we can improve outcomes, and then use that as a parable to try and, you know, it's sort of the virus that, you know, whatever. It's maybe that's the wrong analogy right now. But in any event, it's like because it gets people thinking. Okay, so the problems we were solving for in designing RISE were the dearth of data, that few systems were in fact designed to be person-centered, where the metric of success is what does the person want, right? Which is not simple because everybody wants something different, but it is measurable with goal attainment scaling and a few other methods. And also that recognizes just how binary the systems are that we have, right? We have one set of systems for older adults. We have another set of systems like APS, guardianship, long-term care, whatever it is, right? Another set of systems for alleged harmers, law enforcement prosecution, basically that's it. Elder abuse is defined as arising in relationships with an expectation of trust. And there's nothing for relationships. And there's nothing that, if an older person says, I want help for my drug addicted grandson or my mentally ill daughter, there's nothing, right? To like actually, and I mean, there's a little bit now, but they're mostly, those are totally separate silos, and you have to say, sorry, I can't help you with that, but if you'd like me to, you know, help you move to long-term care or something, we could help there. Okay, so this is our team. We have a super multidisciplinary team, which I think really matters in doing this kind of work. There are 4 core components. Repairing harm, which is restorative justice approaches from criminal justice reform, inspire change from motivational interviewing, which is from the mental health field, support connections, which is teaming, building social support, formal and informal, from child welfare, empowering choice from disability rights. And then overarching, and what we really learned was, if you don't go in, if the advocates don't go in and say, who are you as a human being, and really engage with the person, not like, oh my God, this place is a mess, or you must be so bummed at that son and that he, you know, didn't launch or whatever, you know, like not start with the problem, start with them as a human being. What means something to them? And then go from there, see where the person goes, really follow them. And then goal setting throughout, not even coming in hot with the goals right away either. Just wait and see what goals evolve and what are the person's goals for the intervention and the interaction. This is just, a lot of people are curious about the difference between restorative justice and mainstream justice. So essentially the paradigm for the usual justice system is what rule was broken, who broke the law, and what should the punishment be. Restorative justice is more based on who was harmed and how do you ameliorate the harm, and what does the person need and who should be providing it. So it's a frame shift. This is the, wait, what did I, oh, sorry. I thought I had added one more slide, but I didn't. So we took an ecological systems approach, and essentially also RISE works at 4 different levels: at the relational, at the individual, at the societal, and at the environmental or the cultural, right? So we're trying to recognize that people don't just exist as individuals in the world. They exist with their families, with their friends, in the community, in society, and in the cultures in which they were raised. So that all has a profound effect on what people think is healing and or helpful. Okay, so this is from the NAMERS data. This is actually because of the data systems that are in the data collection in the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. That was one of the things I really wanted to have in the Elder Justice Act. And it kind of happened with this database called NAMERS. In any event, this is from NAMERS data looking at APS. So about 1.3 cases, of which 260,000 are substantiated. And what we do is extend the intervention phase, because the usual intervention is about 67 days. That's really a short time. And people get concerned about RISE being really long, but one of the things is it's sort of a dosage thing. You know, there'll be periods, there'll be fallow periods and more intense periods, and sometimes it's one call every 2 weeks or something. So in any event. So RISE works with people 60 and older experiencing mistreatment or at risk. What ended up happening is that Maine's APS program sent us tons of self-neglect cases. And so as a team, we got together and said, well, we're really trying to study elder abuse, but we want them to keep sending cases, because that was not a foregone conclusion at all. And it turned out that there's a dramatic correlation between self-neglect and elder abuse cases. And that kind of goes back to the engagement. If you sit with people long enough, if you work with them, often other issues evolve. And yeah, I mean, you all know this. So in any event, what we're trying to do, initially was an intervention. We had hoped to get in there before substantiation, before there was any sort of abuse. And sort of by dumb luck, we did end up getting a bunch of those cases. And so it's pretty clear that RISE also has a preventive impact. Okay, so just very quickly for research purposes, we have pilot data from 2 sites. And although Elizabeth is kind to call it evidence-based, HHS called it evidence-informed, which I think is probably more accurate just because it's Maine, and Maine is has very specific demographics. Okay, but we have data from 2 sites, 2 different models of RISE in 2 different countries. So the first is the flagship program in Maine, where we started in 2019. We randomized the intervention in 2 randomly selected counties. The program RISE advocates are housed in a community nonprofit, and they deliver a whole suite of services sort of grounded in the interventions and methods that I mentioned earlier. In 2021, the state took its own money and expanded the program statewide, which was really exciting. To date, we have 900 cases. The average caseload, well, you can read the slide, but it's sort of what one sees pretty typically in this kind of work. The qualitative data, and this just with the proviso that it's lawyers on research again, were really positive. APS has there are a bunch of terms like refusal or decline services or whatever. RISE, the clients are voluntary. They only are, the advocates only work with them if they want it. But with that said, 94% stayed in the program. 94% accepted services, 95% stayed. What shocked us is APS came into this kicking and screaming. And really the only reason it happened is because one of the guys I was writing about, Ricker Hamilton, who is first an APS worker in Maine and then rose to be the Commissioner for Health and Human Services. I've been writing about him for more than a decade, and we had a really close relationship, and he trusted me. I'm like, yo, Ricker, will you let us get in there and do some research? And we started with goal attainment scaling, and then when the clients were telling us, or the workers were telling us, well, we're doing goal attainment scaling, but our clients have goals we can't meet, like help for the son, blah, blah, blah. Like, oh, so I went back to Ricker. I'm like, yo, will you let us try something, augment it from a community nonprofit? And he said, yeah, but do it fast. So that's in any event. So, but then he left, and the APS workers we had a fabulous director, but some of the workers were less than enthusiastic to be participating in the study. But then we had money, and then we had the program up and running. And But the one really remarkable change is the change in how APS workers felt about the program. They were so happy that somebody stayed involved, that they could focus on the more immediate safety concerns, that there was ability to stay involved longer because they have these pretty draconian, you have to close the case, and improve their well-being. They had somebody to like brainstorm on about cases with, and gave them additional resources. And so this is what we call broadly the sleep better at night finding. Okay, so these are, and those are the data, you know, we care a lot about the human data, but to move policy, you need the systems level data. And so I think it's striking about the, you know, self-neglect co-occurring and being a risk factor, but the really big finding is that it reduced the case reoccurrence. So the data showed that APS workers referred their hardest, most intractable cases, and that RISE intervention reduced those cases, reduced re-referrals of those cases by more than 50%. That was the persuasive piece. So, you know, this is just what it looks like, the data. Okay, so now the freestanding program in Canada. Their cases come in from a hotline. Canada doesn't have an APS program. And they do some consultation screening and then randomize the clients into either just the regular, you know, 30, 40-minute consultation by phone versus consultation plus RISE. The preliminary data, my colleague David Burns, who's at the University of Toronto, had to crunch the data to meet with, I can't remember, a funder or some government person or something. And he was like, oh my God, because very low numbers so far because it's a pretty new program, but there were significantly better outcomes in emotional support, perceived stress, so self-efficacy, and my favorite, total life satisfaction. I want to participate for this reason. Like if there's something that can give you better total life satisfaction, that's all good. Okay, so the thing, going back to what happened with Kemp and research and how we connect the dots, pilot data, system support, strategic communications, like when Ricker left and a new commissioner came in, I flew to Augusta and had dinner with her and said, yo, this is a real thing. This is not the last administration's like harebrained idea. This is a real thing. Please support it. So I told you about the pilot. Maine expanded it statewide in 2021. In 2023, that commissioner got the governor to write the program into law. RISE is now part of the permanent healthy aging funded programs in Maine. Last month, oh no, 2 months ago now, ACL awarded us a bunch of money to replicate it in 3 places. And last month, the World Health Organization selected RISE as as an intervention to test internationally. Okay, so how does that take us to the opportunity in Colorado? And I've been really struck over the last few days. So I think the way to say it is this VESPA and what you are doing here is not just like some young faculty's harebrained idea. It's a really big deal in the field. It has huge potential. And because you've got a program, you've got funding, you're collecting data, it meets a need in a health system. It's huge. And you have like historical knowledge of forensics. You have examples of infrastructure in the Kemp Center. You have enthusiasm for collaboration that we saw yesterday. You have a history of innovation. And you have a deep bench. I mean, it's really striking to me how many people are involved in this work. And that doesn't happen a lot. That's really exciting. And so I think that sort of the unified capacity for research and practice can lead to real policy change. Okay, there are similarities between child abuse and elder abuse, but I think I'll skip over that right now. I think one thing to think about is that playing in the background is culture always. And we're really confused about aging, right? On the one hand, we want to live longer and older people have disproportionate wealth, have disproportionate political and electoral power. On the other hand, we're really ageist. And we think about aging combined with fear, shame, denial, and disgust. And the disgust part is a particular driver, I think, of diminishing humanity and abuse. How we live generally as we grow older is, on the one hand, either bunkered alone in our houses or segregated together with older people, which is why I'm really excited about the Attorney General's suggestion yesterday. He came and spoke at the summit and suggested an interdisciplinary collaboration, which I think not only is good for well-being, but also has potential preventive impact. We also and we think, okay, we're going to plan to retirement, but we don't really think about, like, we're living these much longer lives. What do we want to do? How are we going to find purpose? And finding purpose is really good for us. So I'd like to end with sort of what matters most, because it hasn't gotten, I think, as much attention from us as practitioners, as researchers, whatever, educators in the field. I was struck by the fact that that the success of having the chaplain as part of your team. I have been really impressed by that engagement phase that comes first, that says, who are you as a human being? What means something to you? And in writing, I'm writing about pretty dark stuff. And on the other hand, first of all, like, why do we want to stay alive? Time is sacred, right? We have more time on the planet. And how do we shift the focus from aging as this problem-solving venture, like, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to get the care, blah, 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 to like, oh, we have time. What's most important to us? How are we going to actualize and really think about that in an intentional way? So I did a bunch of research into meaning making, and all of these have pretty significant data behind them. So connection is incredibly important, right? It's both love, being involved with the people you love, and the people who are, our communities, right? To stay part of the human community is incredibly important and healing. Not doing so increases vulnerability significantly. And the Harvard Human Study Human Development found that was the most important indicator of well-being as we age. Purpose, right? We want to feel like something is still expected of us. And that too is tremendously healing. There's a guy named Steve Cole who's at UCLA who's done research about, sort of, the Greeks call it eudaimonia versus hedonia, sort of roughly meaning making versus pleasure seeking, and people who are doing things that have meaning to them, grappling with big stuff, volunteering. He looked at people who were volunteering with kids. Like, the short term, both pleasure and meaning making have good outcomes. But in the long term, if we're engaged in activity that means something to us, we're better off ourselves, and we're doing good stuff for the world. And, Steve does all this fancy biological research that is pretty persuasive. Then there's sort of curiosity, creativity, and play. And I feel like we kind of forget about play after we're not kids anymore. And unless we're artists, we kind of forget about creativity. And my friend and colleague, Ann Basting, who was here earlier this year, has done really extraordinary work here, I think. But sort of as an aging person myself, well, I guess we all are, but, maybe ahead of a good number of you, I've found that this is a really exciting time to sort of reconnect with that stuff, like to be a creative person, to think about what are the potentials and to push out in that direction. And so I think that we don't pay enough attention to that. Then there's awe. That's the feeling of seeing the starry sky or the Grand Canyon, or the feeling of deep faith or spirituality, or, some of us do meditation or yoga. Also, there's a study at Hopkins into psilocybin and the impact of psychedelics in sort of helping us feel awe. And the theory of why this is good for us is that we have these super noisy egos. They like are chattering at us all the time and kind of undermining us. And to feel like we're just a small part of this great universe is very healing in a sense. It helps us, just feel like it kind of it's resetting. And then there's storytelling. We are what the anthropologists call homo narrans. We're narrating humans. All this random stuff happens to us over the course of a lifetime. And the way we organize it and think about it is how we tell the story of our lives. It's how we make meaning. It's how we create our identities. It's like, oh, these things happened. And one thing that happens as we age is that older people, we're not asking them about their stories anymore. And Dan was talking last night about these extraordinary stories that older patients tell. And it's, and when you ask somebody about who they are and what makes them tick and what their story is, that is really among the most sacred gifts you can give anybody else, is your attention and your time. And to say, I see you as a human being, and together, then you can create a new shared story. So for me, the thing here is that I think we have greater potential to really focus on this stuff and infuse our work with it, both because it's the right thing to do and because it's protective and because I think it's changing the culture. Storytelling is how we change the culture on all levels, and it's how we change ourselves. And, that's, I think it's tremendously powerful and hopeful. So thanks. I'm sorry, I ran over, but we have a few minutes for questions.
So we're going to open up to questions in the room.
Thanks for an amazing talk. I wanted to circle back. I heard yesterday about alternative response, and I wonder if Colorado has the capacity to study when APS uses traditional response versus alternative response.
I love that idea. I wrote it in my margin and put big X's by it and then forgot to include it. Yeah, I actually think one of the things coming out of yesterday and the conversations today is putting together a list of potential options. I think that's low-hanging fruit. And because it sets up the trial for you, right? It's policy. So you're not going to have to mess around with consenting people and all that. So it's, I don't mean that to diminish it. It's just like it lowers the complexity and you can use the administrative data. Yeah, I think that's a fabulous idea.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back to when you were talking about how we know that power of attorney is both a good thing and problematic because
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Okay, just speak up.
okay, sorry.
I'm just, deaf.
So back to pointing out that power of attorney is both, helpful, but also sort of this license to steal. And I think one of the things that frustrates me in this work is it always feels like our recommendation is like, have a trusted family member, which isn't a very good policy solution. And so I was wondering if you had other like more creative thoughts that we hadn't talked about as much that could be added to the recommendations.
I mean, I don't have great ones, but again, it's an area ripe for testing. One thing is that you can, we could raise the bar for powers of attorney, make them go through fiduciary training or sign something or, be monitored. But a lot of times the person who's a power attorney is already doing a ton of work. And so, I wonder if one thing is to create some sort of a public power of attorney, the way we have public guardians, to just say, if you don't have a person who you trust, that here's an office filled with people who are bonded and licensed and, trained and are fiduciaries who will be powers of attorney, the sort of a public power of attorney program. I don't know of one, probably there's one somewhere, but that's all. It's a real conundrum, I think, because of the burden issue too.
Actually, on that note, I'm curious. Oh, thanks for your talk. Thanks for the summit yesterday. Excited to meet you later today. I'm curious to know whether or not I think in some other states they also have default hierarchies of surrogate decision making that sort of get around that power of attorney or the signed document. As someone who came to Colorado recently, that was one of the things that surprised me about the state policy here. Has anybody examined how that works between states or any sort of comparativeness between, because that is a difference in policy between places.
The way these policies have evolved, it's basically every state is different. And I'm not aware of any research looking at differences. It's true, some people have those kinds of hierarchies, but as my understanding is well, I'm not sure, some are embedded in a guardianship law. I know that, for example, in Michigan, they certainly have a hierarchy, but that is when a judge is adjudicating a petition for guardianship, they have to decide who the guardian is going to be. And so there's a priority list. I'm not aware of that in the context of powers of attorney, which people can enter into. That's just basically a private agreement between two people, and you have to do it while you still have the capacity to do it, so that it's in place if you no longer have capacity. But I think in general, studying this stuff is a really important and good idea.
Thank you so much, MT. You mentioned 3 new locations for the RISE program. Are you able to disclose where they are?
Well, no, unfortunately, it's because I don't know. We're literally going through an RFP process because the way HHS structured the project was to give us the money to do the RFP. So it's actually been a really interesting process to think about, because all of us, I think, probably share experiencing applying for grants is just horribly burdensome. And like they ask you for so much ridiculous stuff. And so we're trying to figure out how do we not do that? So, I'm sure it'll, we'll succeed in some ways and fail in others, but we're trying.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
I don't know nearly enough about self-neglect. Like if you were to point us to resources to learn about self-neglect, perhaps especially in the context of early cognitive impairment, where should we learn?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting thing. Carmel Dyer, who was our colleague who died way too early at the University of Texas, Houston, had a symposium or something out of it that a bunch of articles came out. I can't remember, were they in JAGS? I think they're in JAGS, maybe the gerontologist. But there's more recent stuff. My colleague Stuart Lewis published the data that I showed in, I think it was JAGS, I think it was earlier this year. But also, I should have better answer. I think it's certainly understudied. And, once again, it's really complicated in terms of what is self-neglect versus neglect by others, and when is there a duty of someone else to come in, and when is it a perceived duty, an ethical duty, a legal duty? So it's super, super complicated, actually. And then, the association with trauma, with past trauma, that we've seen some in hoarding. One of the exciting things about this field is that it is rich in opportunity for really meaningful and important work that could inform, that could inform a whole field. So I think I'll take a look, and I can put you in touch with Stuart too, who's at Dartmouth. But it's, yeah, it's certainly something we have to grapple with better and find a better term for, because self-neglect is just sort of heinously victim blaming. And the other thing that we do in the elder abuse field, which makes me nuts, is that we conflate we call elder abuse a type of mistreatment, which also confuses things and people. And admittedly, the line can be very fuzzy, but it's categorically a different thing too.
Thank you so much. We
Thank
really
you for
appreciate
having me. Turn it on. Oh.
But I get time to do this.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Thanks.
No, we should use this. Sean is still around. This, we're going to use I think thank you all so much for participating. For those of you who are here for the division meeting or going online for the division meeting, we'll switch over to that link in just a minute. And this is our biopsychosocial moment. So you have 15 minutes to go to the restroom, get coffee, talk to your friends, do business that can be done in 15 minutes. So enjoy. Yeah. So then gives you a minute.